Ichigo vs Aizen is a fight that we had all witnessed during the Arrancar arc, but what happens when you pit the 1000-year Blood War arc versions of each of these characters against each other? How is Ichigo's overwhelming force going to compare against Aizen's absolute control of his opponent's senses? By the end of this video, you're going to understand why this matchup between the 1000-year Blood War arc versions of these characters isn't even close. But do you know, from the 1000-year Blood War arc, there are a few people who can beat Ichigo and Aizen. These are the individuals who are subscribed to the channel. Only 20% of the people who watch these videos are subscribed, so if you enjoy the content, hit the bell notification and the subscribe button for even more videos just like this. This battle's taking place on neutral ground where neither of the combatants has an environmental advantage and there is no outside interference. Both Aizen and Ichigo will enter at their respective peaks from the 1000-year Blood War arc. For Ichigo, this means that he has access to his true Zanpakuto in its Shikai and Bankai state, the merged hollow form known as the Horn of Salvation, the Granrei Sero Getsuga Tensho, along with his latent Quincy powers which includes Blut Veen, and the full depth of the Getsuga Tensho techniques like Getsuga Jujisho. As for Aizen, this is the version of him after almost 2 years of imprisonment within Muken. He's fused with both the Hogyoku and his Zanpakuto Kyoka Suigetsu. He is also wielding his complete Kido arsenal, which goes up to Hado 99 Goryu Tenmetsu as far as we know, and he possesses his confirmed immortality. The win conditions are simple, it's death or complete incapacitation, and neither of the combatants are allowed to retreat or surrender. So we're starting by going over Ichigo. He's got what might be one of the most absurd hybrid bloodlines in all of anime and manga. Via his father Isshin, a former Shinigami captain, he inherits Shinigami powers. Through his mother Misaki, a Quincy who was infected by an experimental hollow called White, he gains both Quincy abilities and a inner hollow which had fused with his father's Shinigami powers. His Fullbringer abilities emerged through exposure to his mother's spiritual pressure while he was still in the womb, and those powers permanently fused with his Shinigami abilities during the Fullbring arc. So this converges 4 separate spiritual lineages, creating something that has never been seen before within the history of Bleach, and Yhwach, a man who can literally see all possible futures and alter them at his will, still considered Ichigo's growth potential the single most dangerous variable in his entire war against the Soul Society. He just couldn't predict where Ichigo's power ceiling was, and this alone tells you something terrifying about the protagonist of Bleach. Ichigo's feats during the 1000-year Blood War arc speak for themselves. After only briefly training with the Zero Division at the Royal Palace, he went from needing his Bankai just to fight a single Sternritter in their Volstandig to casually overpowering 4 Sternritter in their Volstandig using nothing but his Shikai. His Granrei Sero Getsuga Tensho wounded the Soul King empowered Yhwach severely enough that Yhwach acknowledged that he needed to start taking Ichigo seriously. Now keep in mind, this was a version of Yhwach who had just absorbed the Soul King and was functionally the strongest entity in existence at that point. Yhwach feared Ichigo's true Bankai so much that he refused to face it directly, so he used the Almighty to break it in the future because he openly stated that its power was too formidable. Now this is a crazy admission from a being who possesses a literal Deus Ex Machina ability. The most staggering feat Ichigo pulls off is killing Soul King empowered Yhwach, not once but twice, and he does this while being severely weakened. Yhwach himself states that Ichigo was on the verge of death before their final round even began, and he literally drained a significant portion of Ichigo's Quincy and Hollow powers. A half-dead Ichigo, functioning at a fraction of his full capacity, still had enough attack power to cut in half a villain that was empowered by the god of the Bleach universe with a single decisive Getsuga Tensho. The Can't Fear Onward light novels, which are set 6 months following the defeat of Yhwach, confirm that Ichigo is one of only 3 people alive capable of defeating the hybrid being Hikone at full power. Hikone is a Soul King candidate possessing the combined abilities of every spiritual race. Ichigo exists at the absolute peak of the Bleach cosmology. His true Zanpakuto is classified as a power type. This means that it focuses exclusively on enhancing the user's physical and striking power. When Ichigo is learning the final Getsuga Tensho, Tensa Zangetsu tells him that this is the form that you fear the most, as he drags out Ichigo's inner hollow, who is completely hollowified. He resembles resembles the Vastolore form that Ichigo took on when he fought against Ulquiorra. What we see during Ichigo's battle against Yhwach is the half-hollow Horn of Salvation form, but Kubo confirms in question and answer 578 on his official fan club that if Ichigo were to properly holofy, then he would wear the mask that he wore against Ulquiorra, and he would take on that form, which highlights that Ichigo isn't even utilizing the full extent of his potential yet. When Yhwach confronts Ichigo, he states that once he had awakened his Shinigami powers, the battles that Ichigo had fought were to elevate his powers. His Shinigami powers were further elevated and they allowed him to defeat Aizen. And the true purpose of Ichigo regaining the powers that he lost from defeating Aizen was to take the life of the Soul King in front of Yhwach. So technically this is Yhwach saying that true Shikai Ichigo that had cut the Soul King in half is as strong as the version of Ichigo that had defeated Aizen. So it's crazy to think that this level of power is now Ichigo's baseline in his Shikai form alone. This is before any additional transformations are applied. The Getsuga Tensho fires blasts of condensed, malleable spiritual pressure, which Ichigo is able to shape however he wants. He's able to wrap them around his blade without discharging them in order to amplify his melee strikes. He can also combine them with Seros and fire them in any configuration that he can think of. His Bankai merges two swords into one and fires an enhanced Getsuga Tensho that should be at least 10 times stronger than his Shikai output based upon the established Bankai multiplier that we've known throughout the series. His Horn of Salvation, like I said earlier, mirrors his Vastolore state from the Ulquiorra fight, with conservative estimates placing the transformation at a 10 times multiplier on top of everything else. Some people have also argued that it's even higher based upon Kubo's statements that the form represents only an incomplete mastery of his full hollow power. So if you stack all of those multipliers together, his true Shikai, which is at final Getsuga Tensho level, then his Bankai, which is 10 times that, and then Horn of Salvation, which is another 10 times, and you start to understand why Yhwach was terrified of facing this combination head on. This now brings us to Aizen, who's consistently portrayed as being on a completely different level from the other captains of the Gotei 13, and this was long before the Hokyoku was even in the picture. During the Soul Society arc, Ichigo perceives him as incredibly powerful compared to a captain. Just in his base Shinigami form, Aizen was stated to be strong enough to defeat all of the Espada without Kyoka Suigetsu, using only his speed and power, with Gin internally acknowledging that Aizen's abilities were far beyond any precautions. Aizen survived a point-blank Kido from Yamamoto, an attack that was so powerful that the head captain sacrificed his own arm to perform it. During the 1000-year Blood War arc, Aizen comes out of almost 2 years of imprisonment within Muken stronger than before. Now this is really interesting. When Shunsui removes just a single seal that's covering his mouth, he is shocked to perceive Aizen standing right in front of him, despite only the mouth seal being unlocked. So Aizen's spiritual pressure was so overwhelmingly dense that it could project his physical form before Shunsui without him actually moving from the chair. So this means that Kyoka Suigetsu was already active when Aizen was still fully bound. And this makes sense because he had demonstrated Kyoka Suigetsu when Yhwach had visited him earlier in an attempt to recruit him, and he was communicating with Yhwach via his spiritual pressure alone despite being completely sealed. This demonstrates the terrifying capabilities of Aizen having fused with his Zanbakudo. An attendant who was with Shunsui tried to restrain Aizen but had his hands partially destroyed just by entering the vicinity of Aizen's Reiatsu. Aizen calmly explained that the seals that are placed on him don't eliminate his spiritual pressure, they only restrict it near to him. Then he fires an incantationless Haro 90 Kurohitsugi that releases such immense power that Urahara openly comments that Aizen appears to be even stronger than when he fought Ichigo. This is a massive statement because Aizen towards the end of the Arrancar arc became a being that had transcended the boundary between Shinigami and Hollow. And then 12 years after the defeat of Yhwach, the Echoing Jaws of Hell one-shot confirms that Aizen's colossal Reiatsu alongside Yhwach's has been central in keeping the gates of hell sealed shut. But with Aizen being imprisoned, it's contributed to the gates of hell opening from the inside. What makes 1000 Year Blood War Aizen so different from his earlier versions is the fusion with his Zanpakuto. He's fully merged with Kyoka Suigetsu. He doesn't need to physically draw his blade in order to activate complete hypnosis anymore. Like I mentioned earlier, he demonstrated this by placing Yhwach under Kyoka Suigetsu during the Quincy Emperor's visit to Muken at the beginning of the 1000 Year Blood War arc, and he does this while he is completely sealed. Kyoka Suigetsu's activation condition was always witnessing the release of the Shikai, but Aizen's body is now the Zanpakuto, so looking at him is functionally equivalent to seeing the release. Even while sealed and restrained to the point where his spiritual pressure was limited in range, Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu towards the end of the 1000 Year Blood War arc affected a version of Yhwach who had absorbed the Soul King and had possessed the Almighty, which was able to perceive all possible futures across a multiverse of timelines. Even the most powerful precognitive ability in Bleach couldn't see through Kyoka Suigetsu's illusion. This feat alone places his Zanpakuto beyond almost anything else in Bleach. Then there's the matter of Aizen's immortality. The Central 46 explicitly stated that Aizen's immortality is the reason why he was sentenced to 20,000 years of imprisonment rather than execution, because Aizen frankly cannot be killed. Mai reconfirmed that Aizen is among the Muken prisoners whose hearts simply never stop beating, and that no executioner in the Soul Society could kill him. Even Yhwach, with all of the power of the absorbed Soul King and the Almighty at his disposal, he acknowledged that killing Aizen would be a time-consuming task. I mean, just examine some of his endurance feats during the 1000 Year Blood War arc. He survived being impaled, having his arm torn off, having a hole blown through his chest, and being swallowed by Yhwach's chaotic darkness. He tanked a full blast of Yhwach's Dark Reiatsu, which annihilated the very chair that had withstood his own Hado 90 Kurohitsugi, and he came out of this without a single scratch. When studying their abilities, Ichigo's moveset runs on a philosophy of overwhelming amplification. His True Shikai, True Bankai, Horn of Salvation all stack on top of one another to create staggering output. Aizen's moveset runs on absolute control, with Kyoka Suigetsu, high-level Kido, the Hokyoku's adaptive evolution, and an immortal body. These are tools that are designed to make an opponent's strength irrelevant rather than trying to match it directly. Fans have a saying about this matchup which keeps coming up. Ichigo is stronger, but Aizen wins the fight. Aizen has a complete mastery of Kido which spans the entire spectrum from Bakuda binding spells to the forbidden arts. His Hado 99 Goryu Tenmetsu generates 5 pillars of energy that absorb surrounding Reiatsu to enhance themselves. His Hado 90 Kurohitsugi atomizes anything caught within it, and it distorts space-time through gravitational manipulation. Ichigo's got no Kido abilities whatsoever. His combat technique is fundamentally about finding his opponent and hitting them as hard as possible. Now, this is normally a perfectly viable strategy when you hit as hard as Ichigo does, but a major problem quickly arises when you are unable to even find your opponent because your senses are being manipulated. In terms of physical combat, Ichigo holds an undeniable advantage, and this is what needs to be acknowledged clearly. His striking power is able to one-shot Soul King Yhwach while he was operating at a fraction of his capacity. Aizen's offensive output against the same Yhwach was negligible by comparison. His strongest Kido failed to leave a mark while Yhwach casually overpowered him physically. The stat gap in attack power between Ichigo and Aizen is real and significant. Speed tells a similar story. Ichigo casually blitzes characters who can perceive and react to Ashwalen, a confirmed beam of light, and he does this while exhausted and in his Shikai state. His Horn of Salvation form adds a minimum 10 times speed multiplier on top of that. One of his most underrated feats is outpacing Orihime's reaction speed, which does sound unremarkable until you realize that Orihime has consistently demonstrated some of the best reaction feats in the series, including moments where she reacts to attacks that Ichigo himself couldn't perceive. Aizen's own speed feats are impressive in their own right, as he cut down 4 captain level Shinigami in a single strike, including 2 Shumpo Masters, before any of them could register his movements. He also outmaneuvered holo-masked Bankai Ichigo effortlessly during the Arrancar arc, but the 1000 Year Blood War arc versions of both characters scale differently, and Ichigo's speed scaling against Soul King Yhwach places him above where Aizen demonstrated he could operate during the same fight. When it comes to technique, Aizen is the most polished combatant. The Bleach Character Data Book 3 Unmasked confirms that his swordsmanship encompasses mastery of thousands of styles. He adapted to Shinji Sakanade, an ability that completely reverses perception in a way that its user claimed was impossible to adjust has to, and he does this mid-fight by retraining his combat instincts on the fly. His Hakuda skills let him block blade strikes with his bare hands, and Ichigo is largely self-taught with an extraordinary gift for rapid adaptation. He went from fighting lieutenant level opponents to one-shotting them in the space of days, and he mastered new weapons and combat styles with frightening speed, but his technique remains instinct-driven rather than formally refined. When it comes to intelligence and strategy, Aizen is one of the most intelligent characters within all of anime and manga, and this isn't said lightly. His plans span across centuries, and they manipulate events that nobody else even recognized as being connected. He infiltrated the Gotei 13 as a captain while secretly holifying the Vizards. He created the Espada, engineered Ichigo's entire existence from birth. During the events of the 1000-Year Blood War arc, he does take on a bit of a different persona compared to the Arrancar arc, where he was far more impulsive and arrogant. He didn't lose his composure when Nanana attacked him with the underbelly. He didn't get frustrated when Shunsui refused to remove more seals, and he remained calm during his confrontation with Yhwach. Even Yhwach struggled to understand how it benefits Aizen to protect the Soul Society. There is just a very intimidating aura about 1000-Year Blood War Aizen, so it's even harder to read what's going on inside of his mind. Now, Ichigo is far more intelligent than fans give him credit for. His high school grades are near the top of his class despite his responsibilities as a substitute Shinigami. He analyzes opponent patterns during combat and forms counter strategies in real time. He identified Yhwach's reliance on the Almighty and cooperated with Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu plan to exploit this dependency. Yhwach designated Ichigo as a special war power specifically for his unpredictable growth, recognizing that Ichigo's instinctive adaptability makes him impossible to fully account for. That said, Aizen is playing chess on a board that Ichigo doesn't even know exists. Ichigo's durability is exceptional. He's fought through injuries that should have killed him multiple times throughout Bleach. He's continued battling after being shot through the torso by Lil Barrow. He endured having his powers drained by Yhwach before still managing to deliver fight-ending attacks. His Blood Vein provides additional defense capability that activates subconsciously, and his reactive power level means that he grows stronger even during combat. And with Ichigo having awakened his Quincy powers formally, he is able to consciously use Blood Vein too. Now, Ichigo is mortal and he can be worn down. His Reiatsu reserves deplete with sustained exertion, and his body has definitive limits, even if those limits are extraordinarily high. On the other hand, Aizen is unable to die. The Hokyoku embedded in his chest keeps his heart beating regardless of the damage inflicted upon him. Mugetsu, an attack powerful enough to cut him in half vertically, couldn't destroy the Hokyoku or end Aizen's life permanently. Even Yhwach, with all of the power of the Soul King, decided that it wasn't worth the effort to try and kill Aizen. The Hokyoku has no stated limits on its regenerative function. In a fight where the win condition is death or incapacitation, this creates a huge problem for Ichigo that no amount of firepower is going to resolve on its own. Now, some fans have raised an interesting counterpoint to the idea of infinite Hokyoku evolution. Kubo mentioned on Club Outside that Aizen's final form during the Fate Karakura Town arc, the one that fans call Butterfly Aizen, was intended to represent a dead butterfly corpse. This had led some to argue that Aizen's already reached the end of his transformation chain and he can't evolve indefinitely. But whether or not if this interpretation holds true, it doesn't change the fact that his current immortality is already confirmed and it's functional, because it kept him alive through the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc without requiring any further evolution. Ichigo's peak form is the Horn of Salvation combined with Bankai. Now, this is something that we technically never get to see in action because Yhwach opted to destroy Ichigo's Bankai preemptively using the Almighty rather than engaging with it directly. Now, this refusal is itself one of the most telling scaling feats in Bleach. A being who could see and alter all possible futures looked at this form and decided the only safe option was to prevent it from existing. What we do know is that even without the Horn of Salvation active, Ichigo's recovered True Bankai was able to one-shot Yhwach twice. The fact that Yhwach needed the Almighty specifically to counter this form rather than tanking it with his stats tells us that the attack power at Ichigo's peak exceeds anything else in Bleach. Aizen's ultimate trump card is the combination of Kyoka Suigetsu and the immortality of the Hokyoku working together. Kyoka Suigetsu's complete hypnosis controls all 5 senses simultaneously, creating illusions that are so perfect that the target's own perception confirms them to be real. Even Unohana suspected something was wrong with Aizen's fake corpse during the Soul Society arc, but she couldn't articulate why it was wrong, because her senses kept confirming what was in front of her was real. The Hokyoku grants not just immortality, but adaptive evolution, the ability to transcend current limitations in response to the user's desires. Aizen doesn't need a Bankai to end this fight with Ichigo. Complete sensory control and an unkillable body is already more than enough. The wild card or X factor is critical for this fight, and it's going to decide the entire matchup, and it's the single most debated topic about this particular fight amongst all fans, because before diving into Kyoka Suigetsu, it's worth establishing a pattern that Bleach has demonstrated consistently. Hacks-based opponents have always given brute force fighters problems regardless of the stat differentials. Kinpachi, the strongest Shinigami in physical power, was essentially dismantled by Pernida's compulsory ability, and he had to rip his own twisted arm just to avoid the rest of his body being mangled up. Ichigo himself got one-shotted by Askin's death-dealing ability, and he couldn't do anything without Yoruichi's help. In both cases, overwhelming strength was rendered meaningless by abilities that operate outside of conventional power differentials. This pattern isn't coincidental. If you know Kubo, he's consistently written Bleach in a way where the matchup determines the outcome more than the stat sheet does, and this fight is the ultimate expression of this principle. During the Arrancar arc, Aizen never placed Ichigo under Kyoka Suigetsu because Ichigo had never witnessed the release of his Shikai, which was the activation condition for Kyoka Suigetsu. Aizen himself acknowledged this in chapter 683 when he said that neglecting to show Ichigo his release proved useful during their cooperation against Yhwach. This is a concrete canon statement confirming that Ichigo wasn't under Kyoka Suigetsu's influence because the activation condition was never fulfilled. The key difference in the 1000-Year Blood War arc is Aizen's completely fused with Kyoka Suigetsu. He doesn't need to perform a visible release anymore because his body is the Zanpakuto. He demonstrated this by affecting Yhwach in Muken without drawing a blade. Fans have pointed this out, and some have drawn attention to the fact that even looking at Aizen or sensing his Reiatsu could now be enough to trigger complete hypnosis. The Can't Be On World light novels and the 13 Blades Bleach databook both support this analysis. Some Ichigo supporters argued that he could fight with his eyes closed, pointing to his full-bring training with Ginjo where he fought blinded. Now this is true, but fighting Ginjo without sight is a completely different thing to fighting Aizen without sight. Aizen's mastered Kido, Hakuda, Hoho, and Zanjutsu. He can conceal his presence entirely using Kyoko. He fights at speeds that already challenge the limits of visual perception. Asking Ichigo to fight this opponent without any visual input while Aizen retains full sensory awareness is asking him to win with an enormous handicap against someone who doesn't need handicaps to be dangerous. Some fans have also pointed out that Ichigo himself stated that he can sense when Aizen uses Kyoka Suigetsu, and they argue that this awareness gives him a fighting chance. But sensing that something is off doesn't mean that you can resist the effect. Shunsui also sensed that something was wrong when he was looking at Aizen's Kyoka Suigetsu during the fake Karakura Town arc, and that awareness was absolutely zero help when he actually fought against Aizen. Knowing that your senses are being manipulated means nothing when you can't determine which of your senses are lying to you and to what extent. There have been other arguments that suggest that Ichigo's massive Reiatsu advantage could negate Kyoka Suigetsu entirely, citing the established Bleach principle that overwhelming spiritual pressure is able to nullify Hack's abilities, the famous Aizen vs Soifon example which we all know of. But this argument does have a major flaw. Soul King Yhwach possessed spiritual pressure that dwarfed Aizen's to the point where Hado 99 dealt 0 damage and a casual hand gesture blew a hole through Aizen's chest, and even that astronomical Reiatsu gap didn't allow Yhwach to see through or negate Kyoka Suigetsu. If a being at the very top of the cosmology of Bleach couldn't brute force through the illusion of Kyoka Suigetsu, then there's no basis for claiming that Ichigo can. The Can't Be Your Own World light novels actually reinforce this from the opposite direction. Tokinada Tsuneyashiro used Enra Kyoten to copy Kyoka Suigetsu, but his version was dramatically weaker than Aizen's original because Tokinada Kyoka was limited by his inferior Reiatsu reserves. He struggled to maintain illusions for prolonged periods, and he was limited in what he could manifest. So this confirms that Kyoka Suigetsu's effectiveness does scale with the user's spiritual pressure. But the scaling works in terms of how powerful the illusion is, not whether if a stronger opponent is able to ignore it. Aizen's bottomless Reiatsu reserves mean that his Kyoka Suigetsu exists as a permanent fact of the target's perception from the very moment that it's activated. And you have to also remember that 1000 Year Blood War arc Aizen still had many seals placed upon him, so another critical wildcard in this matchup is how Aizen would perform if all seals were removed. So this is how I read this fight. On paper, Ichigo is the stronger combatant. He hits harder, moves faster in his peak form, and his destructive output exceeds anything Aizen has demonstrated. If this fight were to be determined purely by stat sheets, Ichigo would win it every day of the week, but Bleach has always shown us that the matchup matters more than the numbers. Aizen losing to Ichigo during the Arrancar arc required Ichigo to reach a level of power so transcendent that not even Aizen could sense it. This combined with Urahara secretly embedding a sealing Kido into Aizen beforehand, because even Urahara understood that putting Aizen down permanently was impossible. In this particular matchup, Ichigo doesn't have Urahara's seal, and Aizen isn't making the same mistakes twice. Strength goes to Ichigo, speed goes to Ichigo at his peak, technique goes to Aizen for the depth and versatility of his combat mastery, intelligence and strategy also go to Aizen by a significant margin, and when it comes to durability, Aizen also takes this, because Ichigo's endurance has a ceiling while Aizen's effectively doesn't. Destructive output goes to Ichigo, but Aizen's combination of Kyoka Suigetsu and immortality creates a matchup dynamic that power alone isn't able to overcome. Under these specific conditions, the fight is frankly unwinnable for Ichigo. He's got no counter to Kyoka Suigetsu now that Aizen's fused with his Zanbakudo. He is unable to permanently put down an immortal being when the win condition demands death or incapacitation. Even if Ichigo landed every attack perfectly, dealt catastrophic damage with every Getsuga Tensho, and pushed Aizen to the absolute limit of what the Hokyoku can regenerate, Aizen recovers and Ichigo doesn't have infinite stamina to maintain that level of assault. Meanwhile, a single successful activation of Kyoka Suigetsu turns Ichigo's overwhelming firepower into a liability, because he'd be swinging at phantoms while the real Aizen positions himself for strikes that Ichigo can't even perceive coming. So this is how the fight unfolds. Aizen forces the Kyoka Suigetsu activation early, and given his fused state, even a momentary visual confirmation is enough. Once Ichigo's under complete hypnosis, his power becomes irrelevant because he can't direct it at the real Aizen. Ichigo would be destroying the battlefield, releasing one Getsuga Tensho after another at illusions, while the actual Aizen calmly evades and counters. Even in the unlikely event where Ichigo manages to avoid Kyoka Suigetsu entirely, the immortality factor means that every exchange Aizen survives brings Ichigo closer to exhaustion while bringing Aizen no closer to death. Aizen wins through attrition and hacks abilities, not through being the stronger fighter. This is a very controversial decision for this fight, as I did run a community poll on the channel asking who would win in a one-on-one fight between 1000 Year Blood War Ichigo and 1000 Year Blood War Aizen. As of the making of this video, we had over 20,000 votes, with 62% thinking that Ichigo would win and 38% thinking that Aizen would win. I personally have to disagree with the poll here, as I understand why Ichigo gets the popular vote. He's the main character, he's got the flashier feats, and his physical superiority is undeniable. But when you're actually trying to power scale and look at confirmed feats and as much data as you can, and you're not just seeing who's gonna hit harder than the other, it's difficult to go through all of this analysis and say that yeah, Ichigo is going to beat the unkillable opponent who's able to control your senses. This is the actual irony of the matchup. Ichigo might genuinely be the most powerful Shinigami who has ever lived in terms of sheer destructive capability, but he's going to struggle against Aizen, who's built his entire combat philosophy around the principle that perception defines reality, and if you control perception, you control the outcome. In the majority of scenarios, under the current conditions that we've established, Aizen wins this fight, and it isn't even close. So we've reached the point of the video where I want to hand over the discussion to all of you. Do you think Ichigo's stat advantage is enough to overcome Kyoka Suigetsu and immortality? Do you believe that his True Bankai possesses hidden abilities like the ability to change fate? How would this fare in a matchup against 1000 Year Blood War Aizen? I couldn't really factor this into the video because none of this is confirmed. Could Ichigo's reactive power level allow him to go strong enough mid-fight to negate the complete hypnosis? Where do you stand on the hacks versus stats debate when it comes to Bleach? If there's anything that I've forgotten to mention within this video, then let me know by continuing the discussion in the comments. And lastly, thanks for making it to the end of this one, and I look forward to seeing you in my next Bleach video.
A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.